I'll be talking about some of the principles of project leadership today. So in fact, we're going to be talking about 7 specific principles that make up what I see as effective project leadership. So I am making a distinction today between project management and project leadership. I think somebody once said that leaders play to win, but managers play not to lose. So we want to be on the leadership side of things today, right? So I will be couching this concept in the framework of project leadership today. So I'm hoping by the end of this talk today that you'll have a clear understanding of the difference between a project manager and a project leader. All right. So let me get some of the announcements out of the way. So the agenda, of course, is the keynote announcement. This is the last in the series this year. I'll be giving you a brief introduction to myself for those of you who don't know me. And then an overview of today's presentation. We'll be looking at the 7 concepts. I'll do the presentation itself, show you my contact information at the end, and we'll be done. So I think we'll be covering 30 to 35 minutes of time today. All right. All right, so again, I believe this is it for this year. So thanks for all of you who have attended the previous sessions. I thought they were all excellent. Hats off to my colleagues who did the previous 3. And of course, today we'll be focusing on my area, principles of project leadership. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Howard. I'm the Chief Project Officer here at the Judge Consulting Group. I have been with Judge since 2011, and I did take a 2.5 to 3 year hiatus to work exclusively with one of our A clients, Toll Brothers. But like with many other clients this year, they experienced a downturn in their business early on. And as a consultant there, they had to make some hard decisions. And unfortunately, I was a COVID casualty. So what did I do? I hopped in my car and I drove down to Florida and I enrolled in a flight school. I figured what better time to finish up my flight training than now. So I spent the whole month of August flying for 2 to 3 hours every day to get my private pilot's license. So that's what I did. Just another piece of background information for you. I was born in Japan. I was raised in the Air Force. I've always loved airplanes. And again, I earned my pilot's license in the middle of a pandemic before I came back to JCG. Another interesting fact regarding today is that today is the first, marks the day where the Wright brothers made their first successful flight in 1903. So this is a significant day, and you're going to hear a lot of analogies today. I'm just going to warn you in advance. I'm going to make a lot of analogies between project leadership and aviation. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So here are the 7 areas of project leadership that we're going to focus on today. Pilot and command. So that's obviously, I'm going to lead in with that. Document management, time management, scope change management, budget management, stakeholder management, and project ceremonies. Now we see from these titles, there's a lot of the word management that shows up. Well, that's because these are management disciplines within our profession. But the way I want to approach this today is the leadership factor. I started in the opening slide talking about intangible and tangible qualities that we bring to the table. So even though these are sort of hard disciplines within our profession, there's a leadership quality that a true project leader can bring or will bring to the table in each of these areas, okay? All right, so let's start with pilot and command. And I'm going to make some analogies between the FAA's definition of a pilot in command and the PMI's definition of a project management professional. And of course, you know, flying and just being in that domain for a solid few months, it made it real clear to me that there are some very strong correlations between these 2 areas. So let me start with this one. So the FAA says a pilot in command has been designated as pilot in command before or during the flight. So there can't be any ambiguity about who's in charge on a flight, right? Everybody needs to know, from the flight crew to the passengers, they need to know who is ultimately in command and control of this flight. So we've got to be very clear. before takeoff, who's in charge? Notice the PMI's definition of a project management professional. It's the person assigned by the performing organization to lead the team. One of our first assignments when we start a project in JCG is to identify who's going to be the project manager to run this project. It's kind of the first and one of the most important positions or roles that we fill on a project, because they're ultimately responsible for the success or failure of the project. Number two, under the FAA side, they have the final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of the flight. It doesn't matter how many other flight crew members they might have on that plane. Ultimately, it's the captain who's responsible for the operation and safety of that flight. Same with projects. The project manager is ultimately responsible for achieving the project objectives. Doesn't mean that they're going to do all the work. In fact, typically the project manager is not a developer, he's not an engineer, he's not a tester. They might come from that background, but in terms of the role on a project team, they are ultimately responsible for guiding that team to a successful outcome. And number three, under the FAA side, they hold the appropriate category, class, and rating for the conduct of the flight. So in my case, for example, I am type rated for Cessnas. I can fly a Cessna 172, right? I have a VFR rating, Visual Flight Rules rating. That's all I can do legally. Now, I can fly other types of planes, but it would be illegal for me to do that. On the flip side, on the project management side, the PMP certification validates one's competence to perform in that role. It doesn't mean that a project manager has to have the PMP certification. In fact, I know many great project managers who do not have the PMP, but it's kind of an opportunity to validate, to know, to give you a certainty that somebody that you're looking to hire, if they have that PMP certification, it gives you that extra measure of confidence that they've got the skill sets that you're looking for. Okay. So that's the correlation between flying and aviation from a certification standpoint. So the next principle I want to talk about, and it does fall under the pilot in command, is the concept of flying ahead of the plane. This is one of the most important concepts that I can speak to today, really, not just in terms of flying planes, but managing projects. So in terms of flying a plane, I love this quote by this guy, this Marine aviator, Lieutenant Colonel Ron Cully. He says that you're going to crash if your vision reaches no further than where your body is. In other words, you've got to have foresight. You've got to know where you're going with this flight, right? And on the side of the project management screen, it talks about anticipating conditions prior to takeoff. So some of the conditions that we have to think about in terms of project management is, who are my stakeholders? What kind of environment am I going to be working in? What's the technical environment? What's the stakeholder environment? Do I have consensus? Do I have guidance? Do I have the right team in place? Do I have the technologies that I need to complete this project? The second bullet talks about keeping an eye on internal indicators as well as outside the airplane. Well, internal indicators for a pilot would be the six-pack of instruments right in front of that pilot, like the airspeed indicator, the altimeter, the heading indicator, et cetera. Internal indicators for a project are things like time, scope, and cost. And we typically call those three things the iron triangle. And we call it that because they're related to each other. If you adjust one thing, it's going to impact the other. And we're going to see how significant managing scope is in its impact on time and cost later on. And then the third bullet talks about using dead time to plan the next move. When you're flying a plane, what I found out, there's really never significant dead time available to you. There's always something to plan for. What's the next milestone? What's the next waypoint, that we're tracking to? Am I on track? Do I need to make any course corrections? Am I at the right altitude? Am I safely flying in this airspace? And that's the same mindset that a project leader has to bring to a project. They have to be aware of their environment. They have to keep their eye not just on their instruments, they have to keep their eye outside the instruments, outside the airplane. And they have to use what may be perceived as dead time to plan the next move, and there's really never any dead time in a project. There's always something to plan for. Okay. So moving on to the next discipline, it's the discipline of document management. You wouldn't think that an application development project would have much documentation, but it does. A project has a lot of documentation associated with it. I used to believe, and I used to say that 50% of a software development project was coding and the other 50% was documentation. Well, I've come to believe it's actually even worse than that. I would now say that 30% of a software development project is coding and the other 70% is documentation, right? So what we do in the Judge Consulting Group when we set up a project, we use the project management lifecycle as our folder structure. So we've got initiate, plan, execute, and close. Those are the four major phases of a project. And then we have monitor and control, which is sort of the management side of a project. And in the monitor and control folder, there are two key artifacts that I just want to call out quickly. The first one being what we call a RAID log. And RAID is an acronym for risks, actions, issues, and decisions. And the other artifact is the status report. So these are kind of the two major management artifacts that are common to all projects, regardless of its app development, business process engineering, an infrastructure project. These are the primary artifacts that we use to make sure that we're managing the project effectively. The other four folders contain artifacts related to the life cycle of the project. So when we initiate a project, we'll do a project kickoff deck. The planning talks about the project plan, communications plans, risk management plans, etc. Executing is the actual deliverables of the project, like coding, maybe some design artifacts, etc. And then closing the project. So these four folders kind of represent and house the artifacts around a project. So as you can see, almost 3/4 of a software development project will include non-software artifacts. The next discipline I want to talk about is time management. And I believe Mike Lee spoke to this as well a few weeks ago, but I want to reiterate this because a project leader has to be able to deftly manage time when it comes to a project. And I'm going to make the bold statement here, and I did make it here on the slide, that unless your project is truly date-driven, don't commit to a specific end date too early. Now, we, as project managers, for some reason, we have the temptation to want to say, we're going to be done by this specific date. We don't know at the outset of a project precisely what day of the month we're going to be done with a project. So I think it makes sense. A project leader will manage the stakeholders' expectations and not commit to a specific date too early. However, they will be comfortable giving a date range, and we do. Even for budget planning purposes, we can't keep it open-ended. We have to give, a date range of when we expect to be done. But as you can see, the earlier on we are in the project lifecycle, which is represented by the cone of uncertainty on the right side here, the less certain we can be about when we're going to be done. So if we're in the analysis phase, the probability of our nailing a specific date is plus or minus 0.5 to 2. We could be late or we could be early. We just don't know enough yet. But as we progress through the life cycle of the project and get to design and then to implementation and then testing, at that point, we can begin to see the end, if you will. Know that, okay, we're within 4 weeks of when we should be going live. And at that point, we can be more precise about when we're going to deliver the final solution. So again, that's a discipline, even within JCG, that we have to be more mindful of. And structure our statements of work with a bit of a range factor as opposed to a precise date. A project leader will do this. A project manager will say, we're going to be done on April 30th. Come April 15th, we've got to submit a change order because we're not going to make that date. So again, it's a leadership quality as opposed to a management quality. So the next discipline is scope and change management. So scope and change management, scope happens, or change happens, I should say. I've never been on a project where there wasn't some kind of a change. Scope will change. I can pretty much guarantee you that the scope of a project will change. Even if you think you have all the requirements nailed down at the outset, once we start digging into the weeds of that project and really drilling down to the implementation details, for example, for an application development project, we're going to find things that we were just not aware of early on. And inevitably, that's going to result in what we call a change order, right? So we'll have to bring a change order to the client and ask that client to approve an additional amount of budget, which in turn may push out the timeline for that project. So a good project leader at the outset of the project will set the expectations with the client to say, we've based our estimates on what we know about these requirements to date. However, as we dig into the details, as we drill down and peel back the onion, we may find things about your requirements that were not obvious to us at the outset. We do our best to estimate the effort, but once we get into the weeds, 9 times out of 10, there's going to be something that was uncovered that either the client didn't communicate to us or we just made an assumption about, and it's going to impact the project in some way. And typically, it's going to impact it in terms of all three variables: scope, time, and cost. So that's where we have a change control process. So one thing, JCG, we have a pretty well-defined change control process, and we bake that into our statements of work, that if a change happens, this is how we're going to handle it. We're going to submit a change order, et cetera. So we manage the client's expectations around the potential for change right at the outset of the project. Okay. So budget management. So on this slide here, what I'm showing is sort of the life cycle of a project in 4 quadrants. The carrying out the work piece being the biggest time eater, right? So starting the project is the initiation phase, right? Things are great, everybody's happy, we're all kind of, marching and being on the same page. And then as we progress toward defining requirements, getting things ready for development, for example, we start to maybe either burn more than we expected to burn in terms of budget or less than we expected in terms of budget. And then once we're carrying out the work, we have a delta here. What I'm showing is a delta here between actual cost and earned value. So this is sort of an earned value analysis chart, if you will. And I'm sure many of you have heard that phrase. So the middle line, the dark blue line is like the ideal curve, right? That's the curve we want to track to throughout the life cycle of the project. But the reality is we may actually consume more cost or more budget than we expected, or we may not have delivered as much of the functionality that we committed to. So we have this delta between actual cost and earned value, right? So they kind of traverse both sides of the ideal line. A deft project leader will be able to kind of manage this throughout the life of the project and make course corrections with the client and with the team to make sure we shrink that delta as best we can. Now, it's almost impossible to track that middle black line or dark blue line perfectly, but we want to minimize the delta between the actual cost that we're consuming and the earned value that we're delivering. Those things ideally should be tracking together, but in reality, they're gonna separate from time to time, as you can see in this graph. So a good project leader will manage to this, and they will track this throughout the life of the project so that by the time we get to the closing phase of the project, we have a tight delta between earned value and actual cost. Okay. So moving on. So I'm going to talk about another aspect of budget management that helps the project leader to to manage their budget more effectively. So typically when we submit a proposal or a statement of work to a client, which is represented by the top box there, we estimate at a high level based on what we know about the client's requirements. Say it's a 450-hour engagement based on what we understand about the project, okay? Now what we want to do is decompose that level of effort into manageable chunks. So the next level beneath the statement of work would be what we call epics, right? Those are kind of the more boulder sized requirements, if you will. They're the high level requirements. So we started with 450 hours at the top level. We know we have kind of three major modules or three major areas of functionality that we have to implement. The first one we estimate to be 100 hours, the second one 200, the third one 150. So we've got a little bit of granularity at that level, but it's still not manageable. If we're going to manage to the budget, we've got to get it down to a more granular level. So we got to break it down again to one more level that we call the task level. And the task level is where we manage the budget within our system in easy time, right? And that's where we allocate specific tasks to specific people. So for example, for system change 1, we may allocate, of that 100 hours, we may allocate 50 hours to that change, 25 hours to the next change, and another 25 hours to the third change, right? And at the task level is where we manage whether or not we're making progress, whether or not we're staying on track. So it's a matter of decomposing that high level scope statement down to manageable tasks. So a good project leader will take the time, and it does take a little time, to decompose a unit of work to a point that it's manageable on a daily basis. So this is how we do it in the JCG group. We get it down from the high level requirements down to the task level. And this is what we put into easy time, just as an FYI to you guys. All right. So budget management is a key leadership quality of a project leader. Stakeholder management, that's another discipline of a good project leader. So according to the Project Management Institute, there is a direct correlation between project communications and project success. One of their studies said that 1 out of 5 projects is unsuccessful due to ineffective communications. Now, it's possible that the project was on time, on scope, and on budget, but because there was a lack of communication and managing the client's expectations, that it was perceived to be an unsuccessful project. So just by being effective in our communications and managing our stakeholders, we can raise the level of our success, the probability of our success in delivering projects, by a factor of 20%. I want to share a story from one of my previous jobs. Early on in my career, I worked for a company called PHH Mortgage. Some of you may have heard PHH Mortgage. And I was a young project manager, and I knew we were going to miss a deadline. We were supposed to do a demo for one of the business stakeholders of a system that we were building. And I think it was like a Wednesday, and our meeting was scheduled for Friday. Our next status meeting with the stakeholder was Friday. And so I told my boss when she walked past my desk, I said, it looks like we're not going to make this date. We're not going to be ready to do our demo on Friday. And she immediately said, pick up the phone now. She said, don't wait until Friday to tell your stakeholder that you missed your deadline. She said, pick up the phone now and call your stakeholder. That was one of the best lessons that I've ever learned about project management. And by the way, I do want to say too that at PHH Mortgage, we were called project leaders. Our title was project leader. It was not project manager. And our department was called the Project Office. So I didn't realize it at the time, but they deliberately left out the word manager from our title and from our department to instill a leadership mindset in us as project leaders. And to this day, that was one of the best lessons that I ever learned about project management, is being proactive with communication. bad news, you've heard this phrase before, bad news doesn't age well, right? And the sooner you deliver bad news, and it's still bad, I'm not saying it's not bad, the better though in the long run. So I did pick up the phone, I did call my stakeholder, even though she didn't want to hear that we were not going to be able to demo on that date. She appreciated the fact that I didn't wait until Friday to spring it on her. Okay. So let's talk some more about stakeholder management. So the first bullet talks about considering the needs of your intended audience. The thing about stakeholders is not all stakeholders are cut out of the same cloth, right? Some people need details, want details. Other stakeholders are more high level. They just want bullet points. They just want to be kept in the loop, while others want to maybe more micromanage you or micromanage the project. So it's important for the project leader to kind of get a read on their intended audience. What level of detail does that stakeholder need? The second bullet talks about status reporting. I'm a big proponent of status reporting. Whether we think it's important or not, it is important. Regular status reporting is important, and being able to communicate in a clear, concise manner is super important. There's nothing worse than a busy 5-page status report. Today, the trend is going toward one-pagers, right? So we're doing everything we can within our organization to make sure we're reporting out frequently. When I say frequently, it could be biweekly, it could be monthly, but the important thing is that we're on a regular cadence and that our communications are clear and concise. We don't want somebody to have to read through a lengthy 5-page narrative. It has to be really visual, clear, where we are. So again, the third bullet, the method, the frequency, the level of detail will vary based on the audience. Some people like a lot of detail. Most busy executives want bullet points. So we're tailoring our status reporting to bullet points. And I'll just say one more thing. A status report is not a replacement or a substitute for meeting face-to-face or on a WebEx or a chat. Constant touch points are very important in the area of stakeholder management. It's important that we have regular connections with our stakeholders, not through email, not through just remote connections, but through real live face-to-face interactions as much as possible. Okay, so let me get into some of the practical things that we can do to maximize our stakeholder management effectiveness. So there's 3 primary channels in stakeholder management that we have to think about, right? Managing up, managing down, and managing across. So up, obviously, are internal and external stakeholders, right? And the reason I'm calling out RAID logs and status reports, because those are sort of the management tools that a busy executive will look at a glance to know what the health of the project is. So that's why we emphasize those 2 artifacts when communicating up, if you will. We also, as project leaders, have to manage down, right? We have teams that do the work of the project. We have to provide direction to the team. We have to highlight what's important, what's coming up next. Again, thinking about what I said a few slides ago, flying ahead of the plane, staying 1 step, 2 steps ahead of the team so that you can kind of set the table for them so that they know what they have to work on this week, next week, and then the following week. And then in some cases, we are dealing with third parties, right? Some of our projects involve other agencies, like in the digital space, for example. We work heavily with other design agencies that get involved with designs and so forth. Or we might have a dependency on somebody delivering data or whatever. It could be anything. So our communications is pretty much a 360 endeavor. We have to be able to effectively manage up, effectively manage down, and across. So a good project leader will be able to do that, right? And finally, project ceremonies. So I'm calling it ceremonies because I'm kind of borrowing that concept from the Agile world. It's important that people know what to expect in terms of their time and what activities will be planned moving ahead in this project, right? So there are 5 major ceremonies that are important. And we are an agile shop. We try to conduct our projects in an agile fashion as much as possible. I think that's one of the value adds that we bring to the table here at Judge. We don't just, we're just not product driven, but we're process driven. And the process that we use is the Agile Scrum methodology as much as we can. So the first important ceremony is the project kickoff. So again, I mentioned early on that one of our document artifacts is the project kickoff deck. That's where we go over kind of the ground rules of the project, who's involved, what we're delivering, how we're delivering it, how we're going to manage issues and risks, an escalation path, etc. We also introduce the idea that change could happen, and if change happens, we're going to handle it like this, right? And then from there, we move into taking that high-level scope that I talked about in terms of the statement of work, having 450 hours of work, if you will, and then decomposing that high-level scope down to manageable chunks of work. Because your team, our teams are not going to be able to just look at the statement of work and say, oh, okay, I know what to do with that. No, a project leader will take the time to work with the team to decompose that high-level scope into manageable units of work. And those units of work go into what we call a sprint. So we create a sprint plan out of the backlog. So of those 7 or 8 items that are in the product backlog, maybe the sprint backlog will say 3 or 4, will be 3 or 4 user stories, for example. Okay. And we repeat that process as many times as necessary to complete the full scope of work that was initially identified. And then step 3, the daily scrum. Now, we don't actually meet on a daily basis on every project. Not every project needs a daily meeting, but the principle here applies, that we meet on a regular basis with our project team to make sure we understand what they're working on, how they're doing against what they agreed to work on, and if we have to make any adjustments or if there are any impediments to progress, right? So we use the burn down chart to determine, are we on track? Have we completed what we expected to complete at this point in the process, at this point in the sprint? And then number 4, I consider one of the most important ceremonies in a project is the sprint review. This is where we showcase stuff that we did, work that we did over the past sprint, over the past 2 to 3 weeks. And we showcase that functionality, that new module, whatever it is that we worked on, we kind of showcase that and demo that to our stakeholders. And they see, and they're kind of joined with us at the hip to know that we're making progress. And another benefit of the sprint review is we get immediate feedback on what we've completed. Are we on track? Does it need to be modified? Do we need to take some changes into the next sprint to meet their requirements? I think the biggest benefit out of doing sprint reviews is keeping your stakeholder engaged. Now, back in the old school days, back at in the PHH mortgage days, we used to wait till the very end of a project and kind of do one big demo of an application development project. And the longer you wait to show something, the more expensive it is to fix what's not right, right? So that's the beauty of the Agile framework. We do things in smaller chunks and we get more immediate feedback so that we can make course corrections sooner than later. And then finally, the last thing is the project close. So project, by definition, is a finite unit of work. It has a definite start and a definite end. So if the project doesn't close, it's not a project. It's operational. It's ongoing. We're not in that business. We are in the project business. And we have to close a project. We have to free up the resources so that they can move on to the next project. So this is the project management lifecycle. Initiate, plan, execute, and close. And as you can see, we had a folder structure that mirrored the phases of this project lifecycle. So these are the 7 disciplines that a project leader brings to the table. They're able not to do just the mechanical aspects of the project, but manage the stakeholders' expectations along the way, manage the team along the way, fly ahead of the plane, set the table, Be the leader. Those are the qualities that we look for in a project manager when we hire them here. Okay. So here's my contact information. I think most of you know me. For those of you who don't, feel free to reach out to me. I'm at jhoward@judge.com. I'm in the JCG group. I'm headquartered at Wayne. So I appreciate your time and attention to this keynote today. I think this is it for the year. So we appreciate you joining us today.